which was a VR AR live stream for the Amazon Music Sessions and Twitch. And I very much believe that technology is enhancing creativity rather than killing creativity, and I'm here for it.
Absolutely. Well, it's brilliant to have you with us. I mean, you wear so many different hats, and I'm delighted. You're probably the most of everyone here, the person that's got the most hands-on experience in some ways of how technology isn't killing creativity. Bishi, lovely to have you here. Caroline, tell us a little bit about what you do and how you've got to this point.
Hi, so at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, I'm leading on developing data-driven innovation in the creative industries, including music. And we're looking at how we can create mashups between creative sectors so they collaborate together on innovation, and also how creatives can work with other industries to stimulate innovation in other industries. So it's pretty exciting, cutting edge stuff, and it's never a dull moment. How did I get here? Not a straight line like most creatives, I would think. Started as a singer and a dancer way back in the day, long time ago, Vic. And I sang for 30 years in bands, then retired in 2006 from performing, and have been serving the sector ever since in various guises, one of which was as creative director at Creative Scotland, where I led on innovation and music, amongst other things. And I'm now on the board of the Scottish Music Industry Association, and I'm super keen on bringing innovation into that work as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. Again, hugely skilled in so many different areas. Great to have you with us. Martin, tell us a bit about what you do for Delic and how you got to this point.
Hey, so yeah, my background is in music. I studied music technology, both here in Edinburgh, and then again in the Masters in Barcelona. And then after that, I think things got a bit 2 degrees of like music tech was probably enough tech for a while, and I wanted to get back into music. So I went to Iceland and interned in a recording studio there for a while. And then when I finally ran out of money doing that, I came back to Scotland and just tried to pursue any arts work I possibly could, and sort of slowly drifted towards more exhibition focused stuff, partly because I was looking for more conceptual projects to work on, but also because I kind of found it easier to fight for grant money than it was for Spotify streams. So I ended up more in that direction than playing music. But then the tech came back in a really big way when I was artist in residence for the National Library of Scotland. And of course, for them, I was working with generative AI. So I was making bespoke data sets, really, really huge data sets of built from their collections, and training neural networks to then produce images and video with those, which was a project funded by Caroline's Creative Informatics, actually. And then along the way, I bumped into Ted at some point and started doing little bits and pieces for Delic, bits of machine learning, bits of research. I've been slowly more and more involved ever since, pretty much.
Brilliant. Wow, you've had I feel totally inadequate next to all of you. You've had such amazing careers and done so many interesting things. I like your honesty about easier to or less hard work trying to get grant money than Spotify streams. I like that. Ted, tell us a bit about what you do for Delic and a bit about your history as well.
Yep, so I lead technical development for Delic, but I'm also involved in design and product development as well. So there's lots of design sessions, lots of technical architecture, decision-making, and leading the team to actually implement all of the technology we use. I came to technology through music and art. It's good to see that so many artists are coming from that place first and then adopting technology as needed or as they discover it. So my first, and when I talk about technology, it's digital technology, really. I mean, you can talk about a paintbrush being technology if you wanted to, but really my first sort of use of technology was photo montage with Photoshop way back with like Photoshop 3 or something, and then grew into trying to use technology in much more sort of innovative ways. I did an installation once where I tried to shatter glass with ice in a ray of sunlight. Never quite shattered the glass, but the microphone feedback and sort of technology involved in doing that was quite bespoke. I've done things like taken 40,000 straight pins and reflected the reflection off of one of the pinheads as it was floating in water. And that got me into doing quite a lot of phenomenon-based work and installations, which led to a 7-year stint at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, which is a science museum, but it's a science and art museum, and it really puts art at the forefront. And so it hires quite a lot of artists to do digital installations. And so I started doing quite a lot with sensors and multimedia and interactive media on big screens and things like that. Took a break from that to focus more on music. I came up as a drummer and percussionist, and at about the time that I started focusing more, I was playing in bands all along the way, but mostly as a drummer and sometimes doing some sampling and things like that. But then decided to, because of technology, and because I could be kind of a novice guitarist or a novice bass player, but do quite a lot with technology to make that sound bigger and to compose with it, I started being a solo act for quite a while up here in Edinburgh, and put on some gigs around technology and sampling and that sort of thing. Quite a lot of work in that crowd. After that, I was down in Oxford for a while, leading a team doing software development for researchers and public engagement. We did quite a lot of innovative things like being able to point your phone at museum objects and then play with the objects themselves on your phone, turned the phone into historic musical instruments. So we went and sampled all these instruments that I had in my collection, and then you could actually blow into your phone or move it like a violin to play those instruments and that sort of thing. And then I've been since then doing quite a lot of my own sort of digital installations. Right now I'm building a cloud chamber, which is a device for visualizing cosmic rays. And I'm going to use image recognition tracking software to create music from that. So as these cosmic rays sort of pelt down, that creates music automatically. So it's those sorts of things I'm really interested in as an artist and a musician. And for Delic, as my day job, I try to help other musicians collaborate through our software.
Wow, I can feel a collaboration between Martin, Ted, and Bishi coming on after this conversation somehow, involving cosmic rays, I hope. First and foremost, let's just like the discussion is why technology isn't killing creativity. Critics say that technology is compromising our ability to be creative, but if used correctly, it could have the opposite outcome entirely. So in Delic session number 7, our panelists are going to explore how technology and particularly creator tools like Delic are supporting artists to have more time to make their own music. We'll talk about Holly Herndon, we'll talk about all sorts of different people, but first and foremost, just getting things going. Why do you think some artists, some creative people are scared of technology? Bishi?
Well, I think it comes down to people feeling intimidated, or they feel that, yeah, it's intimidation because of how big everything feels and how complex things can be. Whereas I think with social media platforms like, I don't know, Instagram and, Reels, YouTube, you have so many communities of people just breaking down what you can do. Whether you've got an analog synth or whether you've got, a new DAW, there are so many people who are just willing to share tips and tricks that I think that the fear around technology and the levels of intimidation are really coming down. Because of how the community has effectively reinvented itself through social media. Is it a
question of people, the more people use their phones, look at computer screens, and are generally sort of using tech in their day-to-day lives, whether it be to find out where the nearest restaurant is or anything like that, that they're becoming less scared of utilizing computer and digital, machines, basically. Martin?
Yeah, I would say that I don't know. It's like people are at the same time scared, but then also like it's ubiquitous. So like you probably don't find that there's many people that do make music at all that don't like touch any sort of. Well, I mean, all music instruments are technology at the end of the day, but like 99.9% of music is made probably involves a laptop at some stage. But I guess there's a learning curve, and sort of like, I guess that learning curve can be quite scary, involved in sort of getting underneath the hood a bit, and like, and really getting to grips with like the guts of like how these systems work. Even like a DAW can have like a really steep learning curve. But I think that yeah, as Bishi said, there's like their learning opportunities are really like, especially I think things like YouTube. You can probably, like, I know I have lots of like friends that have learned like real like a craft of like Pro Tools just from YouTube tutorials.
Yeah. Caroline, I mean, you said in your kind of introduction and so on that you used to make music, you're less involved in doing that, the creative side of it. But I mean, have you seen just a massive change, and have you actually had a few steep learning curves along the way?
Oh, sure thing. I mean, I met Ed Stack in 2007, who's obviously part of Delic, foundational part of Delic, a year after I quit the band. And we met in a design thinking workshop at Informatics at Edinburgh University. And we started talking about his fledgling idea then, 10 tracks, which I then weirdly ended up 3 years later when I was at Creative Scotland trying to support. And look where he's at now with the Delic team. So I've seen a huge amount of evolution and innovation occur from the good old days where we were recording on tape on a 4-track Tascam with a WEM and all the rest of it. And we thought that was high tech. And of course, we've gone through all sorts, Pro Tools and so forth since then. So I've seen all of that. And I think to speak to the learning curve, yeah, last few years I've been dedicating myself to learning about blockchain, AI, machine learning, sensors, and interfaces and so forth. And I think to speak to what you were asking around fear, I've been speaking to the sector for a while, but this last 3 years, been doing direct consultation on data-driven innovation. And the fear seems to be that data or digital education or exposure isn't the same as their creative ability and creative education in intensity. So they're learning their ability to sing, play whatever instrument, compose. I mean, that's obviously right. But along with it, the exposure or the in-depth inner workings isn't revealed to the same level. So they talk to me about having a logic deficit of, I don't know how this is getting there. And that logic deficit ends up with kind of not trusting the black box. How did it go from that to that? I don't get it. What's the computation? What's the algorithm doing? Is it acting like, Pro Tools compresses your peaks and troughs to get, a sound and compresses it? They wonder if the algorithm is knocking out all the outliers and everyone's getting medianed in the middle. So I think there's just this understanding gap between input and output, and that is driving the fear. What I'd love to see happening more as we're working at Creative Informatics is just each other demonstrating what it is and working with data-driven innovators who are in the creative sector, but also with data analysts, data engineers, computing specialists, people who are in Python and whatever else, so that you're bringing them together and it's getting rid of this fear and starting to understand it's a toolkit.
Yeah, I think communication really is the key, isn't it? If you have a friend who's an expert at a particular type of technology that you are interested in or want to master, just ask them questions. And as you were saying, Martin, there's a YouTube tutorial for everything. Ted, we've heard all our sort of speakers talk about DAWs, digital audio workstations. There's so many of them now. Do you want to run through maybe a few of them and in fact, all of you, just whichever ones you use, why do you use them? How did you end up using that particular one? And why is it particularly good for you?
Yeah, so I started out really with GarageBand, to be honest. So that's your sort of entry level where it's quite, that is quite an entry level or low bar to entry. I mean, there's so much you can do. I remember for Father's Day years ago, my 6-year-old daughter made me an album with GarageBand. I mean, and that was, she didn't have to do anything other than sing and pick some loops and put it together, and she could make music, you know. So I think there's, you know, your sort of baseline for people to be able to do something quite quickly and easily. And then you go up into professional level tools, you know. I mean, Apple steps you up to Logic, for example, and so Logic is Apple's offering, and it's quite popular. It is not that expensive when it comes to DAWs in terms of, I think it's 100 something, you know, when you're talking about Pro Tools being quite a lot more and being subscription based and that sort of thing. Ableton is another one where it's loop based rather than, so with Logic, for example, and with most traditional DAWs, you're putting sort of linear tracks together, you know, and you put your bass track down, you put your drum track down and your vocals, you know, and they're all sort of layered, and you can cut them up and loop them and stuff. But Ableton works in a completely different way, in which you compose with loops and music and you turn them on and off and that sort of things you compose. It also has linear editing as well, but that's the main sort of thing. And it kind of comes out more from the live community as well. So playing on stage with a laptop with Ableton, rather than necessarily sitting down in a studio and trying to write a song. The stalwarts in the studios, Pro Tools, and that's been one of the biggest ones that people have been using for donkey's years. And Cubase is another really, really popular one. I did want to touch base a little bit on the previous question about fear, because I think one of the things with being a creative person and being an artist and a musician is that you're critical and you're skeptical. And especially when technology seems to be all over the place, and when, you know, you've got the really big players like Google and Amazon and Apple. I just mentioned Apple in the DAW space, but I mean, you've got these huge technology companies that are, you know, monopolizing the space, right? And as a critical person, as somebody who's even trained to be critical as an artist, you know, you look at that and you start to break it apart a bit. You start to look at the socioeconomic aspects of that, the political aspects of it, who's being left out, who's making the money, and all those sorts of things. And so in some ways, it might not be fear so much as it is a bit of a resistance. It's like, do I really want to engage in that same field, in that same domain? Or do I want to take a step back and either disengage and not use it at all as a statement and as part of my work, and try to get back to something that's more sort of organic and human feeling, or do I want to engage and subvert it? You know, and I think that that's something that's really interesting. And then at that point, those who want to engage and maybe want to subvert it, then have all sorts of resources at their fingertips, including, as Martin said, lots of YouTube tutorials. I mean, just ask a question on Stack Overflow and you'll get an answer, you know, pretty quickly, you know. And there's all sorts of things out there that you can kind of hack and put together to engage in technology. Sorry, I just wanted to jump that in, but back into DAWs.
It's absolutely you know, spot on, I think, as well. To kind of, I suppose, in a way, sum it up, it's that you kind of have to be in it to win it. You know, you've got, if you want to operate in a modern digital space, you have to sort of learn how to use the tools at your fingertips, potentially at your fingertips. Bishi, what tools do you use? I mean, how do you compose in your home studio?
So I use a combination of Logic, and I also use Ableton. I've recently got into MIDI mapping my electric sitar into the Ableton Persian, starting to manipulate the sounds, getting familiar with things like Max for Live. And Ableton, it's almost like an instrument within itself. So I grew up using Logic, and there's a formality to Logic that I like it feels proper. Do you know what I mean? That's the only way that I know how to describe it. Despite the fact that I know top 40 records get made in Ableton, and I think you can tell, but anyway, that's just a personal thing. But it's a combination through the formality of what Logic offers me, and then the very user-friendly experimentation that you can have within Ableton. Maybe I should learn Pro Tools at some point. I mean, I did a bit at art college, but yeah, that's me.
Okay, and Martin, how about yourself? Just wondering if you use a different one. I happen to use Cubase, but to be honest, the version I have is fairly old. I need to update, and it will probably be like almost learning it all again. And it's I look over other people's shoulders at Logic, and I sort of go, oh, that looks really intuitive and easy, and that bit looks really complicated. What are they doing there? And you know, they all seem to have their quirks. Martin, what do you use, and how do you sort of make your music and sound design and so on?
Yeah, Ableton a lot of the time. A lot of time Ableton. Max for Live especially, I'm super into. I love it's a whole world into itself in there. But actually recently I've become really obsessed with tidal cycles. I don't know if anyone knows this. It's a live coding thing. So you're like really totally out the door. And if you're talking about, I think Bishi was on this idea that you can hear when certain like tracks are made in certain platforms. And I also agree with that. And one thing I really love about live coding, and especially tidal cycles, is that like it's a real flip on the head of how of those formalities and those like the ways that you think about how stuff's built up and stuff's composed. So and also like it's like an open source thing. There's a real steep learning curve. Like that's very, very true. But I'm coming from programming. I have a lot of experience with programming, but there's also like a really amazing community. And that's like one of the things that's really, really, really great about that platform is as you can like Alex McLean, who's pretty much like the sole designer of the whole thing, and he maintains the whole platform, is like has tons of tutorials, and also is very active in the community, and everyone else is and a lot of other people are really active in the community and to help out and help you learn. So that's what I'm really super into right now.
Can you repeat the title of that, please? What's it called?
Tidal Cycles.
Tidal Cycles. Can I just remind anyone watching, please throw a question into the Q&A box or the chat box. We'll definitely come to all your questions a little bit later on. I know it's us discussing things at the moment, but this is all for your benefit. So if there's anything that we're not touching upon or that you want to ask any of our panelists, please just fire a comment and a question in there and we'll come to it soon. So are you kind of live coding? I mean, are you coding on stage, as it were?
Yeah, that's exactly what it. Well, I've actually, I mean, this
sounds like hard work. So, that sounds like hard work. I mean, are you kind of number crunching, as it were, you know, on stage?
Hopefully one day. I mean, I've only started the last couple of months, so like this has been my COVID lockdown project to learn this. So maybe 2021 is but it's a really big community. Like algorave is what they like. It's like this is the term that a lot of people use for especially dance music that's made this way. So yeah, but it's kind of like that. That's like a really nerdy like approach, just like wanting to see the guts behind it, and that's like a real way to get into that. But it's also really shifts you outside of like a sort of I mean, and Ableton does this to a certain degree as well, as it shifts you away from like a just solely thinking in a Western classical approach, or sort of like having to fall back on being forced into that necessarily. And tidal cycles is like really, because Alex he doesn't come from a Western classical music theory background at all. So the system is not built to necessarily work like that, but it is built really well to work with I suppose dance music in mind, but like building patterns, just patterns as the foundations of composition.
I often think that a lot of musicians really do want to get into the guts of something as you describe it, and know the coding and know the programming, but a lot of them don't. They want it to be as user-friendly as humanly possible. I just want to turn it on, click a few buttons, and I'm back to my project. If you were to advise people watching and music makers, people who are just dabbling in digital making, or at least even just recording themselves digitally, Ted, what would you recommend people sort of maybe start with? GarageBand perhaps, and then what other software and DAWs would you sort of say, try these first, get a little taster, and then you can maybe develop up to Martin's level of coding analysis?
That's a really good question. I mean, you mentioned GarageBand in the sense that it is quite simple to start working with loops and with samples and things like that. One thing I might even say, don't go digital to begin with. Get a loop pedal, and get technology. Start working with some analog pedals and some, well, analog's the wrong word, but analog versus digital. But use some delay pedals. Use some. I mean, that's how I got in with music. It's much more physical, and it gets you in sort of the mindset that then once you start looking at something like Ableton, you know what's going on because you've done it. You've done it physically. I think that's quite important. That sort of physical connection. So yeah, I would say start where you're comfortable. Where for a lot of musicians, it's probably being hands-on, and then move your way in. There's loads of apps on your phones as well, and iPads and things like that are quite a good starting point, because you start thinking in that non-linear way, and you start thinking in a way that's more programmatic and more cause and effect. And that's, once you start thinking in that way, you take these steps towards learning bits of programming. There's in terms of learning to program with music, I would start with just learning some basic JavaScript. And there are loads of things out there where you can just do a bit of coding and get some results. So that's kind of where I'd be.
Bishi, did you start as a musician before learning these sort of skills as someone that recorded themselves? Were you a sort of a traditional musician beforehand?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, I was trained classically in the piano. I was trained classically in like Western music and in Hindustani classical music. And I'm really grateful for all of that. My mother was a respected musician, and I was used to people on tour staying with us and kind of improvising in our front room. And I mean, that is a complete gift and a privilege and everything. But in many ways, I think it hindered me because they have this very traditional, very perfectionist view of what music is and what music should be. And it's great if you're going to be sat in a practice room at the Royal Academy for 8 hours a day. That is one way of doing things, but that's actually not who I am as a personality. So I went to art college instead of going to music college, and I've dropped out of art college anyway because I was into nightclubs and DJing, and the music was an amalgamation of all of those different cultures. But what I would say about having something like Logic, being able to afford something like Logic. My first big gig was when I was a teenager, and I was performing at a film premiere after party, and that's how I was able to afford a computer and Logic and stuff. And it took a lot of time to unlearn all of the prison of classical music, even though it's got some real benefits to it too. And I think that especially kind of younger musicians, I can really feel that they just are less inhibited and they just don't care about those things, which is cool, And I've also experienced, people in orchestras now who have also the formality, everyone has chilled out a lot more, and people are the cross dialogue between genres, between different kinds of musicians. There's a kind of a thirst, and there's a kind of exchange that I don't remember even 10 years ago.
Yeah. I make, or I used to make a lot of music with someone who's I can't read or write music, but I can. It's sort of very instinctive thing to me, and I have a good ear. This musician that I used to play with a lot, he was classically trained, again, brilliant ear, very instinctive. He's one of these people that was pitch perfect. He could hear a note and go, that's whatever, and that's a B, and that never fails to completely freak me out. But he said that he would like to have unlearned his classical training in some ways. I was in awe of his classical training in that he could, if once he knew what piece of music we were writing, what kind of key, what kind of rough chord change, he could just play anything on it, whereas I would have to sort of stumble my way through. But he would always say, you come out with original ideas, I come out with ideas that I've been taught. But I think, your art school education, the amount of incredible musicians that have come out of art school or of an art school background, especially in the UK, I think is, you know, is proof that thinking outside of the box is where the ideas really are at, I think. Moving away from just simple kind of digital audio workstations and recording oneself and having a kind of home setup. Caroline, I know you were keen to talk about how technology is kind of helping performance, and that there are so many different kind of bits of software and hardware that are allowing artists to express themselves in different ways on stage. Tell us about some of the things that you've been talking about, and perhaps Ted, Martin, Bishi, you can jump in as well. Yeah,
so recently I've been introduced to Chagall, who is a dancer singer who's been working with the Miu gloves that Imogen Heap has developed. And Drake Music here in Scotland is also working with Imogen with Miu gloves for people who are finding it difficult to play their guitar and keyboard because of some degenerative illness, and are working with the gloves to take their musical ability and expression and use these gloves to trigger the
Sorry,
music.
can I just jump in? I've seen Imogen Heap sort of demonstrate these gloves, so I know what you're talking about. Could you maybe just tell people watching what they are and how they work and so on?
Well, I probably couldn't do justice to how they work, but essentially they look like a pair of gloves that have sensors attached, and with each finger movement, Imogen can control when it starts and stops, and with movement of the fingers can control the pitch, and with movement of the arms can control speed and pace. And Chagall started using these to trigger her music while singing, and then added sensors to her body, and the body movements are triggering other orchestrations in the background. She also has a motion capture camera in front of her, and she's triggering that, which triggers her avatar, which is on the screen behind. So you've got a completely immersive dance, visual, music performance, and it's just her total expression. And so I've been enjoying trying to understand, getting into the gubbins, into the insides that Martin probably understands better than me, of how that all works. But as a singer-dancer, I'm interested in how the technology is being used to allow that freedom of movement and expression. And there's also notes Imogen was expressing that she says the human voice can't replicate by the way that she might manipulate the gloves and triggering the MIDI. So I'm finding all of that, you know, super exciting, and looking at how it can help people with locked-in syndrome and other disabilities to interface and make music.
Yeah, just to jump in, I've actually used the gloves, but the mini version for a performance that I did for Delia Derbyshire Day at the British Library about a year ago, and I've actually taught some like voice workshops with the mini Moo glove as well, and people love it because it's not just your voice, but like being able to control something with your hand. It transports it to this other physical dimension, and everybody loves it because it's everybody's individual form of expression. So it's not just your voice; it's this full physical extension, and that's the best way that I can like describe it.
Are they quite difficult to use? Because I can imagine to make some kind of chaotic noise, it's probably fairly easy, but to actually master them to the point when you can do what you want inside your head, as it were, that must take a bit of time.
Yeah, well, so I'm a beta tester for the Glover software, and it has a really successful integration into Ableton, which is actually very straightforward. But when you build different scenes, and there are 3 primary movements of the hand. I think there's, like I can't quite remember it, but there are 3 primary movements and kind of different hand and like different fist positions. So it is like choreography in the way that you have to program everything, and then you have to physically remember all of that stuff. So, when you see people like Imogen, or when you see people like Chagall use it, I mean, it's truly extraordinary. I just programmed it for like various effects, and like that was enough fun, But if you're doing entire songs and then like entire live sets based around that, it's really formidable. Brilliant.
Well, to add to that, just to say that Chagall has to rehearse for hours, and it ends up becoming a dance, the whole thing, every single movement. And she says she's performing from body sense memory. So yeah, it's quite an involved process.
Ted, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, well, what's been really fascinating, actually, listening to everyone talk about it, is the degree to which everyone's been using their hands to communicate. So everybody's been using their hands in just a natural and unconscious way, you know, and that's sort of the beauty of these sorts of things, where you can sort of capitalize on these non-intentional or unintentional or non-directed ways of communicating, and especially through music and through art and that sort of thing. So it's just quite fascinating to think about that, because your question about, well, it must take so much to master, I wonder if it really does. I haven't used them myself, but you know, I'm sure it takes quite a bit. But if the other aspect of it is that, you know, that sort of body memory and that sort of thing can bring you to places where you didn't necessarily intend, but are actually quite powerful in and of themselves. Oh, you're muted, Vic.
You're muted, Vic. Vic,
you're muted.
Sorry.
Right.
Technological mistake number one. You kind of, in your introduction, you were explaining that you've been that kind of interface between, you know, and the physical in a way. Do you kind of know how the technology behind the gloves works? And have you done sort of similar type experiments before?
Not necessarily the gloves, but certainly with sensors and that sort of thing. And I mean, generally what you're doing is you're training sensors, well, you're taking input from sensors to manipulate various parameters of sound and of whatever, you know, visual that you're using. So a lot of it is, you know, quantizing, you know, movement, or quantizing, you know, the input from a sensor and turning that into something else. What's interesting right now, though, is and I'm going to bring up AI now because I think it's actually quite interesting, because it's a different way of approaching it, where before you're looking at sort of an analog signal through a sensor, you know, and reacting to when that signal is, you know, it reaches a certain threshold or something to then respond, or you're matching it to the parameter of pitch, for example, which is also sort of linear. What's been really interesting with sort of machine learning, especially with object detection and training algorithms to see patterns in different ways. So for instance, you know, we were just looking, Martin and I were looking in the past, most of Martin actually was looking at how to look at timbre of an instrument and how to train an AI or a machine learning algorithm to recognize, say, a piano from a violin. And there's all sorts of things where you look at the features, the characteristics of the sound, right? Various things like frequency and things like that. But some of the better progress has been made to take from computer vision, where they recognize a dog from a cat, and look at the spectrogram. And so you're actually looking at what image the sound of a piano makes and what image the sound of a violin makes, and training it to recognize those images rather than actually hearing it, which, you know, is sort of is a much different way of looking at making sensors, you know, sensing the environment, where it's almost like synesthesia in a way, where it's like, you know, the piano is more blue and the you know, the violin's more green. Now that's not the way it actually works, but it has that sort of analog to it, where you're taking one thing and sensing and using a different way of sensing it to get another output. So I found that
Martin, do you want to you know, develop that slightly? What are your findings, and how kind of useful is this going to be for sort of you know, music creation?
I'll jump on that just a second. There's one thing I did want to say about the gloves and the sort of performance hardware stuff, is that I quite like that. I've not used much of this at all myself. You know, like and this probably is where my opinion of this comes from. Like, I'm the guy on the stage with the laptop, and everyone's like, "Are you just checking your emails? Like, what are you doing?" kind of thing. And but I don't use any of that kind of hardware, because there's a degree to which I kind of think that a lot of it is a bit of a gimmick, in that like there's a bit of movement that like is like mapped to something that's not, that you could do in some other way, which would be more simple, which would be more streamlined for yourself. But you're doing it because you want to be performative, which is one thing, is really, and is cool. But with what you can't level that at like Imogen Heap's gloves, because she's been doing that for like years. And the thing with these kinds of like with these techs is, with this kind of tech, is that like the more difficult it is to like grasp immediately, this is a generalization, but like the more difficult it is to grasp immediately, probably the more scope it has for creative potential. You know, you can't pick up a guitar. If you were able to pick up a guitar and play whatever you wanted within 5 minutes, the amount of stuff that you would be able to play would be probably quite limited. So the fact that like that those gloves have the range to be learned over a period of years really, to me, speaks volumes, that they've got like a lot of creative potential in them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I suppose one of the questions, let's talk about AI, and let's talk about creator tools. This is this relatively new sort of phrase or sort of term. Explain what a creator tool is, Ted.
Creator tool. Well, that's. I don't really actually use the word creator tool very much, but when you're talking about AI and when you're talking about using technology to create, especially the more advanced the technology is that you're using, and when you're talking about deep learning and you're talking about neural networks and you're talking about machine learning, it does seem quite black box. But what's also interesting about it is that so many other people are doing work. So many other people are creating these things that for you, a quick Google of how do I blah, and you'll get a GitHub repository of someone who's kind of tackled that for you. And what it does, which I find really fascinating, and I'm going off topic a little bit, but we're getting back to sort of collaboration. Mm-hmm. And the idea when you watch a film, right, and at the end of the film, you see all the thousands of people, that were involved in that film, and some of them were, doing things like ordering the meals for something. But there are all these jobs that have been done and all the things, and that they were all important. What's happened, what I find really interesting with sort of advanced technology is the degree to which there are thousands of people that we should be crediting for creating the little bits and bobs that we're piecing together to create the art that we're doing. I mean, so I mentioned the cloud chamber piece I'm working on. There are the machine learning aspect of it, is built on code that other people have developed, and I'm taking and I'm retraining it to look at cosmic rays. But the point is that there's so many hundreds of people who are collaborating implicitly in these works. And I mean, I guess you could say the same about, other types of technology and stuff. But I mean, I think it's especially true when you get into sort of advanced computer science and software that comes out of that, and data science and that sort of thing. And a lot of those people aren't necessarily musicians, a lot of them aren't. But what it does is that it becomes, every artwork that comes out of that becomes this huge collaborative effort. I think we do have this notion in our head, this romantic notion of the solo artist, or the person with their paintbrush, or the singer-songwriter that, has this moment of brilliant creativity and, creates a song. But what's actually happening is so different when you bring technology and advanced technology into it, that you've got this massive collaboration on a huge scale. Some people not even knowing that what they're doing is collaborating on an artwork, but they actually, you stood on their shoulders, when you've created something with it. So I forgot what your question was.
No, that's absolutely fair enough, and it's definitely worth saying as well. It's kind of, I'm really talking about AI creator tools, and the way that people can use these kind of new and constantly developing tools to actually start to integrate with, for example, their DAW, their digital audio workstation, or their live performance setup. What is out there for people to potentially dabble with and use at the moment?
Martin, you just raised your hand. Did you want to?
Yeah.
I mean, I can.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go for it, Martin.
No, I think that I think if you want to see where I think, as Ted was saying earlier, Ted mentioned that the work we've been doing when we were looking at recognizing timbre and classifying timbre, so we can understand how we can automatically and computationally classify instruments. We've looked to machine vision for ways to do that, and that's because vision technology seems to be slightly ahead of audio technology. That's always pretty much always been the case, because that's well, especially in digital, because audio has like a temporal dimension. So there's another thing to deal with there. So if you want to see where creator tools are going in this kind of technology, you look to what's happening for images and video. And the best example of this is a piece of software called Runway ML.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really easy to use tool. Like would be way easier than Photoshop actually, and they have some integration with Photoshop as well. But when you're using it, you're actually using the most cutting edge deep learning models to do stuff. So they have it's kind of designed so that you open up a workspace and you sort of drag and drop in tools. For ones where you've got have a little paintbrush and you click tree and you draw a squiggly sort of shape of a tree, and then you have a neural network create a tree in that shape that looks almost really photorealistic. You've got all these. So if anyone's interested of looking at where this stuff is going, that is a real precursor to what I think that you'll find the kind of integration into DAW that will be,
and that's called Runway
machine learning ML. So Runway ML.
Right. Okay. Runway ML. Wow, that sounds fascinating. I mean, Bishi, when you're making music, how do you sort of incorporate AI and machine learning into actually composing?
Well, to be honest, I haven't really tried that yet, or at least I don't think I have. I know I'm actually working on a project with Imogen Heap for next year, and I was also a tester. She was talking about that program called Endless, Tim Exile's program invention, Endless, which she said was really interesting for kind of improving on. So I know that that's something that I want to open up to. But also, I just want to say, in terms of technology, there's also things like, there are friends of mine who are just into people recording into their iPhones or recording into their smartphones or recording into their devices and just having fun. I mean, all the stuff that like you're talking about, Martin and Ted, is just brilliant. But it's also just the joy of like simple like iPhone recordings and people making field recordings. I think I'm friends with a brilliant composer called Hannah Peel, and she just recorded the rain out in Northern Ireland and like played that to me once. And we're actually armed with the, most people have smartphones and they have a broadcast quality camera and microphone as a part of their smartphone. And I think it's about incorporating just like simple bits of joy back into the process as well.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, I have a new music project, and we released a record earlier this year, but we made it completely in our flats. I mean, everyone does this now. There are top 10, there are #1 records made around the world, which are made on maybe not quite GarageBand, although I'm sure there's 1 or 2 out there. But basic digital audio workstations. People are making hugely successful projects. A friend of mine, you may know him, John McLean, who used to be in the Beta Band. He's a filmmaker. He won a BAFTA, a short film BAFTA. I think he won it, or it was shortlisted anyway, for a film that he made. Phone, everything, filmed every scene, edited the whole thing on a phone. It was a sort of an art project, really, but he submitted it and it was taken extremely seriously because it was really, really good. So you can have high-end kind of results, but you can also, as you say, just have fun, do something basic.
Yeah.
I mean, Caroline, you were talking about the bad old days of 4-track tapes and kind of, you know, have you dabbled at all with making music in the digital world? Do you know what's out there and how you can sort of
Yeah,
the results you can get?
I tried GarageBand, but with an acoustic piano, that was a joke. I was better with my tape recorder, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a CP80, and then of course I couldn't get any jacks to fit into anything that I had, so it was a disaster. Again, tape recorder. Then as I started to move forward, working with people who had home stuff, we did Logic, Cubase. I thought Cubase was complicated, actually, and then we ended up in a studio in a local college using Pro Tools. And I wasn't using it. I'm just watching people using it. My expertise in the band was actually doing the sound engineering and not the recording. So no, I've not really played with it, but I have watched it for many hours being worked through to create sounds. The other thing I used to do is give sound feedback. I know that sounds weird, but my ex-husband used to use all the different pedals that Ted was talking about. And Edge did this as well. He had 44 pedals, 44 sounds and 11 pedals, because each pedal could hold a unique sound, 4 of them, till eventually he just said to the pedal manufacturer, "Can you make me a rack?" So my ex used to do the same thing, and eventually I was getting so good with sound engineering that I was kind of going, well, that sound isn't right. You need to add this, you need to add that, and I started to help program his sound pedals, which I really enjoyed, and I didn't know where that nerdiness came from. But in terms of recording as an artist, no, I used to just sing and watch other people, you know, manipulating things.
Well, as Bishi says, sort of the possibilities are endless. Just diving a little bit further back into AI and just not the pragmatic. I'm interested in the pragmatism of what, you know, musicians with their home studios and with their live setup eventually when we're able to go out and play live again, what kind of AI utilizing tools are out there that they can involve in making music either on stage and live or in the studio? And also, I think some people will see AI as a way of musicians being lazy. You know, oh, you don't have to learn to play that. You can just press a button and the algorithm will work it all out. Is that what AI does? And how can it actually help your music creation?
No, so AI, I mean, so I'm just going to jump in there because I think that I think that there is danger there. I think there is the danger that, you know, AI, when used to create music for sort of corporate gain, you know, so Spotify using it to create mood playlists and things like that, you know, there's danger there, and that is a sort of lazy way of doing it. But there are so many creative things that you can do with it, and the tools in terms of the software tools, and I'm not necessarily talking about pedals or anything like that, but the software tools available to you that turn you more into sort of a sound and data curator than a software engineer. You know, I think even software engineering is going that way, where basically you're not programming very much. You're connecting large bits of data to other large bits of data and making them work together in new combinations. And what's fascinating about that actually is that if you think about tools tend to have, we just talked about earlier, you can kind of tell when something's been made in Ableton. You can kind of tell when something's been made, you know, in whatever tool that you're using. And there's also the sort of limitations that we have with those tools. And especially if you're looking at, you know, Logic is limited in a way that Ableton isn't, you know, and Logic is based on sort of the history of recording studios and things like that. So when you're able to become sort of a data and sound curator and mix and match, you know, with, you know, using AI and some of the tools. So I really recommend people look at Magenta AI, which is, they've got a labs section. If you look also at Freesound has, they've got million sounds and samples to download. Some of them are, you know, what am I trying to say? Creative Commons and that sort of thing. So you need to credit people and that sort of thing. But they also have a lab section where people are using those sounds in really, really interesting ways with very minimal coding, and also in interactive projects where you can start playing around with them. And that's all just free, you know. And so Magenta has Ensign, which you can take, you know, a cat and a violin, you know, which is everyone's dream, of course, to combine a cat and a violin. but you could start going on the spectrum from cat to violin, you know, and using that, I can see using those sorts of tools in really creative ways to make music, and even doing it live, you know, just plug a lead into, you know, your phone, go over to Magenta AI and NSYNC and start, you know, playing your cat violin. I mean, that's a terrible example, but the point is that there's so many of these things out there that, you know, exist live and on the web, that, you know, and in the browser, that just with a low cost phone, you can be experimenting with all these sorts of things that are generated out of AI, and you're really just curating the sounds and being creative with them.
Yeah, Bishi, you've mentioned Hannah Peel and Imogen Heap. Someone else who's kind of right at the forefront of kind of music technology is Holly Herndon. I mentioned it earlier on. Have you heard about her Swarm AI recording system?
Yes, I have. I actually presented a documentary for Radio 4 about a year ago, and it was called Swooshes, Synths and Spawn. It had a really kind of exciting title. But Holly Herndon's Spawn was a part of that whole documentary. She's phenomenal. I mean, just even from her early interviews where she was talking about how, you know, the emotional connection that she has to her laptop and to everything that goes on with it, it kind of opened it out to a much more positive relationship to a machine, rather than, oh, here's this kind of lump of metal and it's taking over my life and blah, 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 blah. So, you know, she's always got, like, you know, I mean, she has a phenomenal point of view on stuff.
Yeah, sorry, I think I called it Swarm. It's Spawn, isn't it?
Spawn,
yeah. Martin, have you had a look at it, or are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I'm familiar. We should also say, like, as a little plug for next time, so Holly Herndon and her partner Matt Dryhurst they work together on this project, and we actually have Matt Dryhurst who's in the next Delic session.
Oh,
so
cool.
There'll be much more to talk about. You know, we'll be able to, if you have questions about this, you can direct them directly to the person who made it. Yeah, Spawn was a really interesting project. I used I've used similar tech, not quite as not for audio, but for images, with the National Library. So yeah, I mean, this is the real forefront of where things are going, and I think Ted is totally correct when he's talking about curation. And I think the kind of curation is like the dominant cultural production of our age. If you look at like Instagram, or, you know, like any like influencers, or like everything is basically about curation. And I wanted to kind of dovetail the point someone made earlier. Well, I think that she was talking about how, you know, like the accessibility of everything, even from doing stuff on your phone, and I guess that this kind of, like, people talk a lot about the democratization of music production, and I kind of I have a problem when people say that, because I think that it's a very extremely limited view of what democratization can involve. For instance, there's no, like, I don't think that governance or ownership has been at all democratized, and I think this dovetails quite nicely with what a lot of people's fears are around what AI could produce, because we don't have any really, like, we aren't breaking new ground on models of ownership or tech. Well, for technologies of ownership, you can look to kind of like blockchain and stuff like that. So there are examples of this, but I guess that if there was more ground being more work being done in that direction, I think it could assuage a lot of people's fears around what around generative AI, especially. I mean, for example, I mean, the biggest problem is that you've no way to tell. There's no mechanisms currently for crediting people that are used in data sets to generate music, and there's got to be some huge. The first massive scandal is probably going to cause that to there'll be huge legal suits, and eventually we'll have to catch up with that. But I'm sure it'll happen way too late. But I think that these kind of and I think that at Delic, actually, we're trying to like
truly democratize, rights management and ownership as well as music making. Yeah.
Yeah, especially because I mean, our founder members are being given equity in the company.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea that like if we allowing people more to buy in to the tools that they're actually being able to use and have a bit more control over them, I think it would go a long way to assuaging a lot of people's fears.
Yeah, and one of the fears, and one of the Ted, you talked briefly about it or mentioned it earlier on, is the idea that streaming services are now kind of creating their own artificially generated music in order to not pay artists royalties, which is about as cynical as you get. And that's, I suppose, the sort of makes people immediately go, oh, AI, modern technology, it's not for me. And also, I think people are still searching for that sense of authenticity. People want, something personal, something real. And quite often they see artificial intelligence as obviously artificial rather than authentic and real. And these are not necessarily true of visionary new artists. It's absolutely authentic, it's absolutely personal and real, and yet it's just using the AI as a tool within itself, right? Would you agree?
I would. I think the issue of access too, one of the things, so just about anybody, with a bit of effort, has tools available to them to make music of some sort, right? Or to make art of some sort. What they don't have is access to an audience. And, that's where some of this really becomes problematic in the sense that, right now, getting people's attention to listen to what you're doing, and to actually then even, maybe make a living, from people listening to what you're doing. That's the really difficult part. And that's where we've got a lot of problems with access at the moment, and I don't necessarily, have, a lot to say about solutions other than maybe Delic, but the point I'm trying to make though is that while there's the access to the creator tools, the bar to entry is getting quite low, so that you don't have to have a lot of technical knowledge. The real challenge now, I think, for us in the creative arts is is to democratize the access to market, the access to audiences, the ability for people to really break through. And that's one of the areas where sort of algorithms and AI, comes into play, when algorithms aren't allowing, new things to break through, and they're really sort of relying on old habits. And that's and learning from the existing framework in which people can be brought to the fore and get other people's attention.
Okay, well, I think we should get some questions now because we've had a few questions come in. So we'll probably jump around a few different topics here. But Jerry Kramskoy has been in touch saying, what are the panel's thoughts on tech for simplifying and speeding up music education to provide more musical ideas for creativity? For example, more awareness of sounds available beyond standard chords or cut and paste in DAWs. Yeah, simplifying and speeding up music education. Perhaps Caroline, you could maybe chat about that.
I was thinking about this actually because I saw the question come in, and I'm not entirely sure I've arrived at an answer, to be honest, Vic.
Well, any of you have an opinion on that? What do you think about tech on simplifying and speeding up music education?
I'm not sure things can ever really be sped up. I think
Yeah.
they give the illusion of trying to speed up. Like there are certain ads you get on YouTube or whatever, and it's all about the simplicity of learning, which I think is great. But I think this idea of, like in 5 minutes you're going to be an amazing guitar player, or it takes a little bit of time, like even if you're trying to learn like a VST synth plugin or a nice reverb effect for your guitar, you have to work out what it is it does and everything, the whole nature of curiosity is that it takes you on a journey, I think this whole kind of the thing around convenience, I mean, and speed, I just tend to ignore it because it's a way to just hook people in rather than, you know.
Yeah, the one thing I did think about in terms of what would have speeded things up for me was you talking, Vic, about the person you knew with perfect pitch. When I was singing at school and in the choir and taking violin lessons and in the orchestra, and frankly, not very good at any of that really. But I was following the dots on the page. I found that, well, it became second nature after time. But I think what would have speeded it up for me is Sibelius, if I had access to that, because I could sing and then see the note appear on the page. And I didn't even discover that till many years later. That would have speeded things up for me a lot. And then being able to create music with my voice, which was my main instrument, that then somebody else could read what I was creating and play it. And when I played the piano, I didn't learn properly. And my ex-husband used to stand over me and say, that's the chord that you're playing, you need to write the chord down. And I would be inverting chords, seconds and fifths and all sorts of things. I was just making it up. And I didn't know how to write it down and tell anybody else what I was playing. So I think for me, that would have been a great speeding up, but I don't know if that's a point Jerry's trying to achieve. So I was getting a bit stuck about how to answer it.
No, I think the point, it's a absolutely valid point, Carolyn. And I think you're absolutely right as well, Bishi. I think, everyone's in a rush to master something really quickly. Actually, it's the taking the time, it's the going on the journey that's the important bit. But it actually is, and learning to do something can be an enjoyable process. You don't just need that quick fix end solution, as it were. And learning to play an instrument is fun. Ted, I can see you wanting to.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think with where technology can help, and I agree completely. I mean, it takes time, it takes practice. You've got to do it again and again and again. It's repetition, all those sorts of things. But motivation is one area where this can help. When you've got the chords, the tabs to any song out there, and usually transposed to any key that you want, it's a lot easier to learn how to play guitar when you're trying to learn how to play songs that you love, right? And when that's instantly available to you, and not just in the way that was originally played, but in a simplified way, where it's like throw a capo on, and now you're just playing these sorts of things. So that sort of access to a lot more things that will actually chime with what you're interested in personally, that can speed up education quite a lot. And I think that's quite good. And I think the other thing is, like, what are you trying to learn? Are you trying to learn how to be a virtuoso, guitar player, or are you trying to learn just enough chords to go out and write your own songs and be a singer-songwriter? They're completely different things, and technology can help you do the latter probably a lot faster than it used to. I mean, I remember having to buy books and look up chords, and you don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's just get through. I think we've gone way over our time limit of an hour or thereabouts. So let's rush through some of these questions, if you don't mind. Ben Price has been in touch. He says, could Bishi tell us more about the Volta experience, please?
Yes. So the Volta experience, so we had a very short amount of time to get this performance together, just because of when the Amazon gig came in, and it was a combination of my system and their system. So my kind of Ableton and Looper and electric sitar setup, talking to their setup. We had a Light Pro iPad which was tracking my movements, and one of the guys from Volta was operating that. And then we went through a process of constructing the world that I was actually performing in. I mean, it was just like absolutely formidable, but then we had to send everything through 2 auxiliary channels, which was then talking to Amazon, and then that was beamed over at Twitch. And I mean, it was, I learned so much. We had like 5 or 6 different systems talking to each other, and then you have to make the distinction between the world that we're in, or like, we were in a room. So it's like, hang on a minute, what world are we talking about? Are we talking about Volta, or are we talking about like the room we're in right now? So I mean, it was totally beyond anything that I've worked on, but I loved it, and it gave me a real respect, not only for people who are coding, you know, VR and stuff like that, but also to the experience of live streaming. I just learned so much. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well,
that answers the question in some way.
yeah. Thanks, Ben. Another one from Akis Katsupakis, who says, maybe all of these really exciting new tech, such as the gloves and AI software, are moving us away from musical creativity. Maybe this conversation is more about artistic creativity in general, but it does kill musical creativity as we know it, creating something new. What do you think about them apples, Ted?
I fervently disagree. I mean, I think that's looking at creativity in sort of a limited way as something that, you know, comes from a person's, you know, soul. As like, it's a very romantic notion of creativity. But I think creativity has quite a few different parameters to it. And I think that if you are that using and manipulating a tool in a way to create something new is a form of creativity. And I think that there's, you know, this, and sometimes it can be quite transformative to have available at your disposal something that didn't exist before, and a new opportunity, a new possibility, something that you weren't able to do before, all of a sudden opens up a completely transformative palette of options. So I don't think, and I think a lot of, you know, a lot of the way we respond to music and respond to art, it's us responding to it. I don't really think that there's necessarily this, you know, truth that the artist puts into it that gets communicated to the user, right? What does get communicated is all these different inputs that we then connect with, right? There's something that we connect with emotionally, but it's not necessarily the same thing that the artist put in, you know. And I think even during the act of creation, we as artists are responding to what we're creating. We're throwing lots of stuff out that doesn't really connect with us, and we're leaving lots of stuff in and creating new things that do create a response in us, and we hope that they create a similar response in somebody else. But I don't necessarily think, I don't really agree with the romantic notion that I have some sort of brilliant creative idea and all the technology is going to get in the way of that.
I think it's opening a new door, Vic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as musicians, as we go through our musical genres of life, you open the jazz door and you shut it again because you go, oh my God, that's going to take me forever. I'll be down this rabbit hole for a long time up to want it. But if you look back to the Fairlight, when it came in, it opened up a door for Kate Bush, Pink Floyd, Brian Eno. And without Brian Eno, my, you know, I don't know, my life might not be worth existing. It's like, that doorway for me was, awesome. Yeah. So I just wonder if this is just another set of doorways. And as Ted said earlier, we're building on the shoulders of others.
Well, do you know what, that, unless anyone's got something to just add in there, that seems like a really nice way to sort of put an end to this. And just because we've been chatting for quite a while, there may be a couple of other Fiona Pilgrim saying, making a shameless plug for Leith Theatre's crowdfunder to install its heating in its Baltic auditorium. 1/3 of the money raised will go to homeless charities. So there's a plug to Fiona. She also asks Martin to share his views on AI and copyright with IPO, but that could take a while. So what I'm thinking is that if anyone watching has enjoyed the discussion and wants to get a more in-depth answer to any specific question, then why not email hello@delic.network. So that's hello@delic.network. You can use the hashtag make some noise as well. Get in touch with that email address, and obviously join us in 2 weeks' time for Delic Session number 8, which is going to feature Holly Herndon and various others. It's called Independent or interdependence, and that's going to be really interesting as well. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all my speakers and panelists today. Bishi, Caroline, Martin, Ted, you've all been wonderful. We could talk about this, as with all of the Delic sessions, for hours and hours and hours. Thank you for sparing some time to chat, and thank you to all of you watching. I'm going to plug my own thing. Listen to Six Music tonight, because I'm on from 9 o'clock till midnight and all this week. So there you go. That's a final plug for me. Lovely to see you all, and we'll speak to you all in 2 weeks for Delic session number 8. I hope that.
All right.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Bye.